Hello and welcome back to Crypto Sapiens. Today's episode is a bit different than others you may have grown familiar with. It is one of a four-part mini-series that explores journalism and Web3. DiJourno is a series hosted by Crypto Sapiens with the help of Journo DAO and other top builders in the Web3 and journalism space. It seeks to return to the roots and definition of what journalism is all about and to demystify concepts and tools in Web3 that can aid in the process of decentralizing journalism. We hope to present to you, our dear listeners, with many of the novel applications that are being developed today. I truly hope you enjoy this content and find it useful in your crypto journey. Let's get started. Hey, everybody. I'm EurekaJohn, and welcome to the Dejourno series, episode 1. Today, we have 4 members of the Journo DAO, and this is a 4-part series in which we'll look at different topics in decentralized journalism every week for the next 4 weeks. This series dovetails off of other mini-series in the Crypto Sapiens space. The first one was Web3 ID, and then we had decentralized science, and then now we have decentralized journalism. So we're looking at these different components and these different ideas and these different industries and these different spaces and seeing ways in which they can improve through decentralization. So I guess we can start out with a little introduction of each person, just a brief introduction to say who you are and why you're interested in decentralized journalism. So you want to start from the top, Eric?
Yeah, hi, my name's Eric Mack, and I've been a freelance journalist for the better part of a couple of decades now, and have always lived and reported from rural America, and so I have kind of a keen interest in news deserts and places where there's not enough access to journalism, and I think that's had a kind of devastating impact on civic life around the world. And just a couple of years ago, stumbled into Web3 and DAOs and saw some interesting potential there through decentralization to maybe address those issues, and met all these fine people in the process. And now we're just kind of hanging out, trying to figure things out and building what we hope will be the future.
Hi, I'm Crystal Street. I am was a photojournalist for many decades. I was freelance for the most part. I stumbled into this group back in the spring and really fell in love with the mission. As a news junkie, I just am really into making sure that journalists have sustainability in how they report, but also keeping the specter of corporate and advertising executives out of the way media is presented to the public. I see media as a public good, and I'm hopeful that we can figure out a way to restore that sustainability through decentralization so that communities can have access to factual information again, so democracy can function properly. That's the big picture.
Yeah, hi. I'm Keith Axline. I had about a decade in media and journalism at Wired Magazine and then at Medium, and have since become a software developer. So I kind of came into JournoDAO helping with technical stuff, but I also have a decade of built up ideas about how things can work a lot better in the space, and primarily getting off of advertising as like a business model, and connecting the value of journalism to the people who are actually paying for it and benefiting from it. So yeah, that's why I'm here.
I'm Nick. I've been in the crypto space for like maybe 11 years whenever Bitcoin first became a public thing. Both sides of my family work in cybersecurity, but I was focusing more on biochemistry. And about 2 years ago, I started working in the cryptocurrency space, and now I'm doing on-chain analysis to basically apply that to investigative journalism.
So here we are, we're talking about decentralized journalism and Web3, and there's not a whole lot of mystique, I guess, around the idea of what journalism is, but there's a lot of mystique around what the idea of Web3 is, and Web3 is definitely a buzzword. But we have a lot of people, when they hear about the crypto space, the first thing that they hear about is a scam, and they hear about NFTs, and they're immediately turned off by it. Whenever I hear people think about crypto, they immediately talk to a Bitcoiner, and the Bitcoiner has to roll it back, and they're asking, what is money? They're just really trying to define the very, very fundamental part of it, to re-examine our preconceived ideas about what we know about money. And they're going back to caveman days. When did money start? What is the origin of it? So I guess my logical first step would be for decentralized journalism is to define, what is journalism? What's it supposed to be? How did it start? So do you guys have any ideas on that?
Trying to say, I guess it depends how far you want to roll it back. Because journalism and like newspaper publishing as we know it actually started more as propaganda, like at least in the United States and in parts of Europe. Publishing began and was run mostly by political parties, and so it's really only in the last 150 years or so that the idea of some sort of process for journalism and journalistic ethics came about. I went to journalism school at the University of Missouri, which touts itself as the first journalism school in the world. And it was only founded in around, I don't have the exact year, it was around 1910. So that should give you an example of how new these concepts are. And to me, there's a lot of, I think, different definitions out there that we're constantly arguing about, like whether objectivity can even exist or is possible. But I always, like, what I try to practice, what I was taught and like what I believe in, is that journalism is just the process of trying to get at the truth of the world and the universe and life, and doing it in as fair a way as possible. If you can't achieve objectivity, which again, that's a conversation we can have another time, to strive for fairness in talking about the world the way that you see it and reporting what you see in a fair way. I think that's kind of at the essence of what I try to keep in mind when I'm working.
Okay. Yes. According to Wikipedia here, journalism is the production and distribution of reports on the interaction of events, facts, and ideas and people that are the news of the day and that inform society to at least some degree. I didn't know that journalism was, like, as a formal discipline, was so new. I mean, you hear about, old newspapers, the town crier, ships coming to port, and then people yelling from the ships about news from the far off lands. But as a discipline, as a formal discipline in the United States, around 1910.
I mean, arguably a little bit earlier. That's when the first school of journalism, where somebody sought to actually teach it in a standardized way. And before that point, it really was the domain. I mean, number one, if you go back much further in history, there's not a whole lot of literate people walking around. The masses weren't necessarily reading, so gossip kind of ruled the day. And if you were literate, you were probably among the elite classes, and so those elite classes had newsletters for their political parties. And so most newspapers actually were originally attached to a political party, and still to this day, some newspapers in the U.S. are called like the Democrat Gazette or the Republican Herald, something like that.
Yeah, and I think it would be good to demystify it a little bit, as I kind of view it as not a formal, necessarily a formal process, but I feel like there's some friends who are more journalist-like that I have than others, where they're not willing to just take my word for something, and they're like, well, why do you think that? Oh, wait, what did that say again? Where other friends are just like, oh, really? Oh my gosh, that's crazy. And it's this idea of getting a lot of different viewpoints and then trying to triangulate not even a consensus, but a truth that was maybe counterintuitive, or at least you're open to it being some new information, right? Because there's definitely ways to go about collecting information that just confirms your pre-existing ideas, and you can feel like that's journalism. But unless you have actually conceptually opened that door to actually being surprised, changing your mind, learning something new, then you're not really gonna do that. And that's really hard to do just like as a human being. And so I think formalizing that practice into journalism is helpful for people who don't just naturally find that state on their own, which is probably like not most people, but it's something anyone can do.
One thing I want to add, kind of piggybacking on what Eric was talking about, in the past, before newspapers, a lot of news was transferred peer-to-peer, but it was in taverns and bars and in the third place where we would gather as a community. So now we can kind of transfer that into decentralization because we're gathering in community virtually. You just have to put the frameworks in place to make sure that like there's fact checking and that there's, that information is factual, but it's still peer-to-peer transfer of information.
That's really fascinating, because the way when you said, Eric, you said a lot of it was driven by like the Democrat Gazette or whatever, but driven by and top-down organizations, and I could see in ancient forms of literature being government sanctioned town criers, and then even in the Bible, the books and the epistles of Paul were underground letters. Journalism that was more peer-to-peer, and that was decentralized. What Crystal's describing in the pubs and the taverns is as a decentralized peer-to-peer system that brings more of in the concept of editorial autonomy, because I was wondering when this concept of editorial autonomy kind of really came into play and the importance of it. And, in journalism school in 1910, where you said that started, that's kind of, to me, with modernity, where the whole idea of editorial autonomy kind of came into play, that didn't really have to follow. People were trying to be as objective as possible and not follow an agenda and, almost a scientific method type of modernity concept. So this editorial autonomy, how important do you think it is in journalism to be a true journalism?
Okay, wait, how are we defining editorial autonomy? Because that's actually not a phrase that I know.
Editorial autonomy, I guess, would be the idea of not having some kind of centralized control guiding what you say from a top-down type of.
Oh, okay. So like, I guess I would call it editorial independence, but yeah, that's exactly the same thing. It's just a synonym. Like I don't know how much you want to get into the history, but if you go back to like the era of like yellow journalism, when you had like the owners of newspapers like William Randolph Hearst and Pulitzer, who like were warring with each other, and they were advancing their own interests to the point of like making war through their newspapers. Following that era, the idea that, well, maybe we should have kind of a firewall between reporters and what they write and the interests of the owners and later on of the advertisers as well. If we're going to maintain our reputation for telling people the truth, it might be important to introduce this idea that the actual journalists should be, as you say, editorially autonomous and free to report what they see in front of them and what they see as the truth, instead of, basically just what the editors are, I should say, the executives and advertisers would like to see. I hope that answers your question. I'm kind of curious what Nick thinks of all this.
So I think you're right that to look at things in a historical context when it comes to journalism and media in general, it has largely been about propaganda, and having editorial authority is kind of how we define what the truth of something is. And also we can get into this later, but the tricks involved in how media is digested by people has a lot to do with what we use to like define what the truth of something is. For example, it's a saying in journalism that whether or not you agree with what the news is saying to you, they kind of set the topic of conversation. With every new generation, it resets people's attention, and it resets how people are able to ingest and filter out information that they're being presented with. And that's why propaganda works fundamentally. Also, the fact that everybody's kind of busy and working, so there's not necessarily, education, people's ability to invest time and looking at daily events, all of that ties into how we formulate the equation of like how media is ingested by the population.
So if you have too much centralized top-down control and too much propaganda, then that creates almost a breeding ground for unorthodox publications and views, and to create a festering revolution almost of sorts. It kind of is bringing me to the modern day era of where we are now. And how did journalism get to the state that it is in now? And what kind of state is journalism in right now? We've had Web 1 come in, and revolutionize the medium, the platform in which people can express their views. And so how has that led to where we are?
So I guess I feel like we have in the last 100 years gone all the way from one point where we're talking about, a couple of media magnates and industrialist billionaires who own publications dictating the agenda and the news of the day. We've gone from that to a little over 100 years later, kind of the exact opposite, where everyone can now publish whatever they want on a variety of platforms. So that it's weird in that the platforms are centralized. I'm talking about like Facebook, TikTok, Twitter. But that does provide on the macro scale, like a decentralized approach to news, in that anyone can now be a reporter and put out their ideas and their observations to the world. Like that's really new in human history, that anyone has access to an audience of potentially billions. And what's interesting is the results are kind of the same, whether it's like highly centralized by, these few guys in New York in 1910, or it's, decentralized to the point where anyone, bots, whatever, can take advantage of these platforms to put out whatever kind of polarizing news or propaganda or anything. The result is kind of the same chaos. And so I guess we're kind of at a point now where it's really important to bring journalists back into the mix in a trusted role, basically as now the role going forward, I think, will be as curators of just this mass of information that the global populace is putting out there. Whereas in the past century, journalists were giving you all the information that you had access to. If you wanted news of the day, it was probably just coming from a journalist or gossip. And now that gossip is everywhere, along with tons of other data points. So in the 21st century, the role has been from information provider to moving to information curator.
You say that it's become extremely decentralized and anybody and everybody can be a journalist, but I mean, 5 corporations own 90% of US media outlets right now, so how does that work together? That seems very centralized to me.
Yeah, I was just going to say how surprising this outcome is from the perspective of like late 90s, early 2000s. Like it really was the consensus, I think, that if you gave people the tools, you would democratize publishing, and then we would kind of have this utopia. And what we didn't really even conceive of at that point was like the algorithms of distribution and scale, and the ways that the attention of the mainstream and just the public could be hijacked through various ways. And so, we thought the battle was like just putting like Blogger and WordPress and all these things in people's hands, and then they could do it, and then everything would be great. And now we've kind of moved up a level where now we're seeing that like, oh, everyone needs their own algorithm, and they need to be in control of like the way that they find things, because if you put a business behind the algorithm, then things go haywire and you kind of hijack the collective subconscious for purely economic reasons.
And 2, I think we're seeing what happens when the electorate or the general population loses the ability to both trust the media they consume and then understand the media they're consuming. So we have a lot of people that are consuming information that is just either completely not factual at all, or they don't have the discernment to understand the difference. And I don't think we've seen that in the context of, weaponized algorithms as well, like Keith's talking about. You're delivering content in a way, and people don't have an ability or haven't cultivated the ability or lost the ability to digest that information in a way that allows them to interact with the world in a more balanced manner.
Yeah, it's kind of like how Google Maps kind of ruins your ability to find places like on your own. It's like I used to have really good direction sense. And now I'm like, if my phone runs out of batteries, I'm like, wait, where am I? How do I get back? And so I think, we've offloaded a lot of this skepticism and a lot of the work involved in just discerning what's meaningful and truthful for us to platforms that don't really have our best interests in mind.
So decentralization has, in a way, ironically created centralization.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of provided the substrate for like new extractive businesses to be built on top of it. And so I think, part of the DiJourno movement should be to pull the agency back to the individual and really express the variety of thought that's out there, rather than forcing everyone to identify with these mainstream archetypes that are kind of reinforced for commercial reasons by the like you said, just the 4 or 5 companies or entities that control a vast majority of what we see.
Well, we have a lot of centralization right now in our media, even though there are plenty of decentralized, I guess not decentralized, but plenty of ways for individuals to have a voice. So it is kind of a catch-22. Eric, you talk about news deserts. This is a concept I've never heard of before until now. With us having nationwide media, and continual access to it, how can there even be news deserts? I don't understand this.
So over the past 20 years, the amount of local newspapers that have closed in the United States runs it's over 1,000 newspapers that have closed in one generation, and it's a trend that is happening in Europe and Latin America and pretty much everywhere as well. News desert, I believe, if you're looking at the site that I usually look at, is defined as you live in a county or an area that has one or fewer daily or weekly news outlets. Whereas, in the past, most metropolitan areas, would have at least 2, usually multiple newspapers. So, just an example, some of the brightest red is actually where I live there in the middle in northern New Mexico. By the way, not interestingly, that bright red section kind of right there, the border of Colorado and New Mexico, most of that is where the biggest wildfires in the country were this summer. So I got to experience firsthand what it's like to live in a place that's literally burning down with no local journalists to deliver some vital information to the populace. And to get back to your question a little bit, so like what I think has happened in the last 20 years, interestingly, what killed these newspapers more than any single factor was Craigslist. Not that Craig Newmark set out to murder local newspapers, but just the fact that suddenly in the early 2000s, we all had access to basically a free classified service that you could post to for free instantly. I mean, it's frankly a better service than the classified section of most newspapers that we all grew up with. And that eliminated a really vital source of revenue for newspapers. And then it just kind of got worse from there. And so as the advertising business model didn't hold up in the face of Web 1 and Web 2, a lot of these papers closed down. And so then you have fewer local journalists covering what's happening in actual small towns, even large and mid-size cities. So, just kind of coverage of basic stuff like school board meetings, city council. That's a lot more rare than it used to be when I was a kid in the 90s. And so my theory, not just my theory, but one that I agree with, is This dearth of local news compared to the past, what has filled the void left by that is social media and national news, and both tend to be more toxic and more polarizing than your local news, because when you're dealing with stuff that's happening in your own backyard, and when you're dealing with people that have, I don't know, maybe different views or just disagree with you on, where the next landfill should go, it doesn't. I mean, you got to work with those people, because these are things that affect your daily life. Not so much the case when you're dealing with national issues. They're happening in DC, and they're with people that you don't have to interact with on a daily basis. And so, these conversations get a lot more heated, a lot more toxic, like immediately, especially on social media, because of some of the reasons that Keith brought up with the algorithms. So all of this just kind of makes our civic life a lot less pleasant and a lot less productive.
So there's like a sense of accountability that comes with local news and local coverage, right? That's lacking in social media and in national news.
Well, it's like that guy. Like I have some friends and acquaintances who live in my town. I see them out. Our kids go to school together, and we're cordial. We have a great time. We'll have a drink at the bar, and then I'll go home and see the same person kind of flaming me on Facebook or Twitter in a way that he never would to my face.
Yeah,
and we've probably all had that experience, and I kind of think that's going on writ large with the media, because there's less local coverage. All we have is a really polarized and unhealthy national debate to entertain ourselves.
Yeah, and if you think about it, you kind of have to, the further away something is from you, the more crazy the news story has to be for it to be interesting to you, where it's where the landfill goes is super interesting to you because you don't want to have a backyard be your landfill or whatever. But then if you're going to be paying attention to what's going on in Florida or whatever, then it's got to be, Florida man dances with gator, 6-second video, something like that. And so it's the whole incentive structure is kind of backwards for making people care about the nuances of what other people are doing.
And in the absence of that local media, what we're seeing is at these school board meetings and town councils, there's a political strategy in place now because there is no local media covering it. So those meetings are becoming so polarized. They have to have security at some of these events. And that is where a lot of these divisive political movements are emerging from, is it's starting at school councils and town councils, because there is no, local journalists there reporting it. So people can swoop in, polarize, and then strategically go in the direction they want to go in. And we're seeing a lot of political transformation happen at the ground level in community that was, in the past, you had those reporters on the ground covering it in a different way. And we don't have that anymore.
I'm trying to restrain myself from letting other people talk, but yeah, so I think that's a really important point that Crystal brought up, because I think a lot of the problems that we see, they're in local communities, they're in microcosm. So what you're really the role of a local journalist is to sit in on those boring town council meetings and take 10 seconds of every individual's day to tell them the one thing that they need to know about that town council meeting that's relevant to them, that's relevant to whatever happened, and the rest is filtered out on the back end. And if something crazy happens, there's a reporter there, and that's supposed to check the behavior and kind of be a check on accountability of politicians and accountability of how our system is supposed to function in theory. There's supposed to be a human curator of the public interest, and that's completely demolished. Not to be really cynical, but that is kind of, I think, not the way that things are at the moment at a local level. So a lot of these local papers might do day-to-day kind of run-of-the-mill stories, but if something interesting happens in that community and that local paper is not there to cover it, there's no accountability. And a lot of investigations start with local investigations. That's just something that most people don't know.
That makes a whole lot of sense, because now that I'm starting to understand the idea of news deserts a little more, because the journalist really is a note taker. I mean, that's it in a way. You know, they're the local appointed note taker. They're the distiller of information, and that people come to rely on and trust. And you want somebody, even in our Discord meetings, when we, you know, have a bounty or assign somebody to be the note taker for the meeting, we want to trust that that person will take good notes. Yeah. So, and even court reporters as well, and the people drawing the pictures in the court, because, you know, they can't have cameras in the courtroom. We want to trust that that person will do good at their job and creating kind of an objective view of what went on. So that is, those people are becoming unemployed, and that's creating the news deserts.
Then their publications don't exist anymore. Like, I'm actually in an area in Boulder where they still have a strong local media because it's Boulder. And they have reporters in all of those meetings, and they write about it and they tweet about it. So I can actually keep in the loop of everything that's happening around me when a fire happens or when a council meeting is going on. But that's a resourced area. So it's not a news desert. So in the absence of that resource, or a lot of these local media's outlets have been bought by, consolidated by, you know, Sinclair Media owns a ton of them. And that has a very specific media agenda. So, or political agenda too. So yeah.
Yeah, one quick thing to add, John, sorry, Keith, to what you were saying is, in addition to the local journalists just taking notes, and another important thing that journalists provide is context. Because yeah, you can go to these meetings and just, like, you know, be a stenographer and then, like, report back the most interesting thing. But it's really important to have a person that goes to all of the meetings, and so that, you know, when somebody comes in and says, hey, we want to build a new power plant here in your town, it's going to create all these jobs, it's going to lower your power bill, that's great. I mean, you can take notes and report that, but you also need somebody to say, yeah, but, like, yeah, aren't you the company that poisoned the water over there like 5 years ago, that I reported on back then? So there's also this important being ability to provide the whole picture and all the important context, as well as just what happened today.
That's really insightful.
Yeah, part of that's, like, they know their audience, right? Like, they can take the information, and then in order to distill it down into something useful, you have to know, like, your audience and what that audience needs to get from you. And so I think that's what a lot of, like, the centralized media, when they come into, like, more regional areas, they don't really know what's relevant, and so they just kind of cram their one size fits all story into whatever outlet they can find. And I was just going to comment, to me, what makes sense of this is just the same stuff that happened with you know, Walmart moving in and basically shutting down small businesses through, like, anti-competitive practices. That's basically what media has done to, like, these news deserts, where they were and in a lot of cases, like, literally, like, under attack and targeted, and didn't have the resources or whatever battle was thrown at them. Like, it was easier for centralized media to come in and, like, offer, like, websites for local newspapers who might not have, like, the technical resources or budgets to, like, you know, hire somebody locally and do a website. And then and so everybody goes to, like, this place that has a website because everybody's on the web now, and they just kind of outcompete on these things. But then they only staff that website with, like, 2 people, and they just, once the other paper goes away, then they just stop competing on, like, the local stuff, and then they just become syndication machines for whatever the backing company was of the website who came in. And so, you know, companies did come in and start trying to compete on local news, but then once their competition was gone, it was really easy to just suck back all those resources and just stop doing that.
Well, how does advertising dollars come into play here? And how is Web3 going to be able to counteract that and solve that? I guess we can start with, how is advertising warping that? And then we can move into Web3 here.
In terms of, like, you know, how the advertising dollars connects, I guess I think of it in terms of how the business model has kind of shifted to the Web 2 era, in that basically everything is now based on clicks and attention, like the actual currency of the day. I mean, it's always been attention, but now it's just been revved up to a scale where, you know, you have a 24-hour news cycle, and like all that matters is getting clicks on what is trending like right now. And like I say this a lot, but it's kind of a funny peek behind the curtain of my life as a freelancer is I'll write a story, nothing mind blowing, but just, you know, kind of the developments of the day, 300 or 400 words on something that happened. And that story, the actual text and body of the story might get edited once, but hopefully once or twice, but the headline will be edited like 7 or 8 times. And then it'll be constantly revisioned and A/B tested over the day. And that's all about whatever it takes to get the clicks, that get the eyeballs, then that is connected to the advertising. And the result is that in this era, in the internet era, news has really become a commodity, where it's just about quantity over quality, and it's about speed over accuracy. In a lot of cases, just in the fact, you know, you put out the facts as you think you have them in your mind, like at that moment, and if it's wrong, we'll correct it later. Like that's just kind of the standard in the industry, which seems okay, except that, you know, we know from studies that the first impression that people have of a story, they hang on to, and they don't often see the corrections that come down the pipe later. And so it's funny with like any breaking news event, whether it's a shooting or a natural disaster, just the way those things evolve when you're reporting on them, the like very first take on the very first bit of reporting on this breaking news event, it's never 100% accurate. It just never is, because you're always playing a game of telephone with officials and emergency responders or eyewitnesses, just whoever you can get a hold of, and they never have the whole story, or maybe they didn't see what they thought they saw, or they're playing telephone with gossip. It's never right the first time. It always takes a day or two to start to nail in the facts, but that first impression from that first bit of reporting is what sticks in people's minds. And that's all tied to, like I said, this priority of quantity over quality and speed over accuracy. I don't really have a solution for that, but it is the reality.
Yeah. Have you all ever seen or read a story and then you get to the bottom and it's like, oh, update, like the premise fact of this whole story was actually wrong. But then later, like you're going to recount it to friends and like you'll forget that like you read that small like correction at the bottom that just basically nullified the whole narrative, and then that narrative just like sticks in your head.
I think of a bigger picture too with advertising, and this isn't a new issue, but a lot of times in your bigger media outlets, the advertiser themselves has a lot of sway on the editorial selections and what's run and how it's run. The movie Good Night and Good Luck actually really looked deeply at Edward R. Murrow's attack on or reporting on McCarthy. And he had to go to Paley, who ran CBS Entertainment, and argue repeatedly to make sure that he could continue down this line. And they had these arguments about how the news is a public good. And Paley, who was the head of that entire industry or the entire entity, was like, I have advertisers still. And you can't say these things right next to my advertisers because you're immediately going against their best interest, and they pay the bills for you to be a public good. And so we still have this debate now. Now it's just at scale. And you have the billionaires buying the outlets. So one thing that I have hope for in decentralization is that we can figure out a way to make a monetary engine that is not reliant upon a corporation or an advertiser. So there is no editorial conflict that enters the conversation.
Yeah, and if you think about it, like the reliance on classifieds early on in journalism and news was kind of a fluke, and it created this whole path dependence for for decades, where you're not actually paying, like nobody actually pays for the quality and the value that they get from news, right? Like I think it's pretty universal that we've all derived like significant value from news stories that we read, and like very little of that was actually stuff that we paid for, and like really our economy doesn't even know how to materialize that value. And so I think that's one of my like biggest hopes for JournoDAO, is to like actually get down to first principles, like what value does journalism provide and to whom, and how can those people be made to see that that's the value that they're getting out of it, and then pay for it like directly to the source of that value, where you had this like weird subsidizing where it was like advertising classifieds over here, and then that's subsidizing free news over here. And the economy was never really set up for people to be like, oh, the news is a service that I appreciate and get value from, and I should pay for it. And so I just think that's really an odd place to be in history. And things are finally breaking enough now that people are re-examining it, and I think there's opportunity there.
So advertising pays the journalists and the news outlets bills. For advertising to work, you have to have polarizing type of content to bring in the clicks and to bring the attention. So it's this kind of like flywheel effect and this catch-22 that you can't break out of, that we're kind of stuck in, right? How can Web3 break this flywheel?
Well, so I guess I'm interested. This is why we're, at least I, and I think some of the rest of us on this call are interested in the potential for local journalism, because I think that's where we can kind of begin to build up from the grassroots and kind of rebuild in a healthy way. And I kind of think of it as like the people who are listening to this are going to be familiar with DAOs, and a DAO is nothing more if not a community, right? And it's a community in which we're using these new tools to craft the rules of the community, the rules of conduct, and also to determine how value is created and exchanged within the community. Well, what if we were able to take these tools and basically map that onto a real world community, of which a local news publication is part of it, in much the same way like DAOs have their own publications. You're doing one right now, and so the local news publication is part of this community. Again, let's think of the community as a DAO, and anyone in the community then has a stake in that publication, and can contribute to the publication. And it's just kind of this virtuous circle of, instead of kind of thinking of the newspaper as this separate company, it's this building over there that's just reporting about what's going on in the rest of the community. And it's always kind of this black box, like, oh, we got to get the newspaper out here, we got to get a reporter out here. How do we get them out there? How do we, like, what if the community was actually had a window, on the newsroom, and on some sort of the editorial process, there was community ownership and community interaction with the media outlet. And I think, Web3 potentially gives us the tools to begin to do that, to have community ownership over a local media outlet, kind of in like a co-op model.
Transparency, right? Like,
yep.
we can't see Twitter's algorithms or Facebook's algorithms. It's behind the black box somewhere. But what if those algorithms were able to be seen and audited, and so everybody knows how those algorithms work? So when we see these targeted, posts and stuff like that, we know that we're being targeted and how and why.
Right. And I was just thinking at the beginning of this conversation, like, what if history just worked out a little bit differently, where, the 4 or 5 main companies that are kind of controlling the internet content right now, I'm thinking of like Amazon, Facebook, Twitter, Google, and I think I'm leaving one out. But what if one of those, like, just through an era of history, what if the BBC had become, one of the main Web2 platforms, a journalistic organization that, has these ideas of transparency and fairness, baked into its ethos. What if Facebook was a journalistic organization instead of a profit-seeking organization? Like, how would that have shaped history differently? And unfortunately, no media organizations were really in a position to assume that role. I would say largely because the importance of skepticism in journalism and in the media, it's such a strong part of the ethos, and that's healthy. But it also causes a lot of self-inflicted pain in the media. And I feel like we're at a similar fork in the road right now, where there's these new technologies emerging with Web3 that are very aligned with a lot of the ethos of journalism in terms of transparency and in terms of wanting to create an immutable historical record. Like, these tools are just built for journalism. And I fear that very few are going to take advantage of it, and we could be repeating history again. But we're going to shout as loudly as possible to in the hopes that won't happen.
Yeah, and for me, a lot of it comes down to if you want to get concrete about it, just disintermediation, which is one of Web3's superpowers. Where in the example of, now if I wanted to just pay a local journalist or tip them or something like that, for a story that they put out, or I wanted to contribute to a crowd fund to go and investigate this local issue that I think is important, but there's no advertiser who would want to advertise against it, then how would I do that? You have to go through a bunch of legal entities and Web2 platforms like either PayPal or Venmo, or you have to set up a website. You have to do all this stuff, and Web3 makes crowdfunding and transparency kind of intermingled, where we don't have to get a bank involved because potentially somebody could steal all the money. It's once the money is digital, then you can at least know when it's on the rails what it's going to do. And so just like Web3 is kind of removing the need for banks, I think it's removing the need for a lot of these kind of gatekeeping institutions that we rely on to get things done on a local level. And it really just puts us in touch with each other directly and removes some of the ways that can go wrong in the past.
Well, we're almost out of time. I wanted to get some final thoughts in here. Nick, do you have any final thoughts?
I think to tie it back into cryptocurrency and why that's a piece of this at all, why people continuously bring up Bitcoin and Ethereum, and it's kind of annoying. But it is the reason that's a part of that conversation is that I think journalists should understand that it's about building a new incentive model to fund public goods. That's really what everybody's trying to do in the space. And a lot of the disenfranchised skilled labor is seeking ways to basically rebuild their industries because they don't trust laws and governments to successfully get that job done because of the anti-competitive nature of how these industries have been co-opted and kind of the game has been rigged, in their opinion, or at least in a lot of these people's opinions. I won't speak for everybody, but that's the way I see it. So for me, it's about bringing those skilled people to work on the problem in a way that's going to be effective and take it seriously and see if there's anything out of that can be useful to traditional infrastructure to learn from.
Yeah, there's some very big philosophical topics in media and decentralization we can dive into, but what I often come back to is just the community journalism. And in some of these small towns, like in Quartzsite, where you were recently, John, there's this woman, I don't even know her name. She runs the local Desert Messenger newspaper by herself for the most part. She sustains herself on ads because this population is older, and they still run ads for the local pie shop when they have a 2-for-1 special. So it funds her work. And a few years ago, she broke a story about the water table being depleted outside in the BLM lands north of town by the Saudi Arabia corporation that was growing alfalfa and sending it back overseas. And I read this story. I was like, this is impressive journalism from this woman who just runs this paper out of the goodness of her heart. And the AP picked it up a month later and ran the story nationally. So I think of that and how can I empower someone like that through this technology so she can continue doing this work without having to beg Deborah's Pie Shop for an ad buy. Like that's kind of where I boil it down.
Yeah, I guess I would just want to try and make this a universal problem for anyone who, like, whatever you're concerned about. I think your problems get better if there's a strong local journalism or journalism in your community. Because for me, there's a straight line between the deterioration of local journalism and the centralization of media and the increase in like corruption and polarization in politics, which pretty much prevents, any progress on so many fronts that we care about. And so this is why this is like a foundational upstream issue that I'm passionate about is I really think if we get local journalism back, then a lot of this, I don't know what you call it, just misinformation, disinformation, corruption, all that gets stopped before it can really gain ground. Like as soon as you get somebody who games the system and people see that they can be successful, then that just floods the system with people who want to like one up that person and then take that spot. And it just, the incentives immediately kind of go to zero. And so we really need, all the people who do bad things and do corrupt things, they come from communities, and we need those communities to be stronger and more informed, just so that we can all get back to just being human and like working on things that matter and that we all agree on, because fighting amongst ourselves is getting pretty old.
And then Eric, you get the last word here.
JournoDAO.xyz. I think everyone else said it perfectly. Yeah, there it is. Check it out. We've got a founders NFT if you support the mission. And if you're a human and not a bot, we'd love to have you in the community and in the Discord, and hope to see some of your smiling faces at, probably ETH Denver and other things coming up. And I'm going to go get this fly now.
I have noticed the fly. I do want to say, yes, this program here with Crypto Sapiens is in collaboration with Journo DAO. And if you get a founders Journo DAO NFT, you will be supporting Crypto Sapiens as well. A percentage of that will be going to Crypto Sapiens to help continue this form of journalism as well. For those of you who came here just for the Web3 side of things, I hope you understand a little better now of what journalism is all about. I know we didn't get into the brass tacks of all the Web3 tooling and everything like that, but we will. This is just episode 1. We wanted to lay the foundation and the groundwork and figure out what it's all about, because I don't have a journalism background, and I've been trying to. I really at first just came to the Journo DAO town halls for the companionship. Until I really started figuring it all out. And now I'm starting to actually wrap my head around a lot of the stuff, including news deserts as well. So thank you for that, and for laying some of these definitions down. The next episode will be about tooling. So we'll get into some of the nitty gritty of how we can do this. And then the third one will be talking about some more philosophical concepts. It'll be a little more open, but we'll be mainly focusing on censorship. And then the fourth episode, to wrap it all up, we'll be talking about funding and how we're going to do it in public goods, in journalism as a public good, and Web3 journalism as a public good.